I have on either side of me two people who know a lot about journalism. Nick Kusnetz from InsideClimate News, so he actually covers climate. We're going to rely on him for actual knowledge. And Scott Simon from NPR.
No knowledge whatsoever.
And I will claim no knowledge too, though I've done some climate coverage. One of the words I've heard a lot today is narrative. But I really wanted to start by asking Nick and Scott a question that Julie raised earlier on. She said, where's the media? And I wondered maybe we can start with you, Nick. Where is the media, and does the media have a responsibility to change the narrative?
So, first, where's the media? I would say fractured, right? Scott was saying this, I don't mean to steal you, but there is, more than ever, not a media as a single entity. Yeah. And so, for example, my organization is a nonprofit news organization. So our money comes from foundations and donors, and we have a mission. We cover climate change, and we also have a public interest and accountability mission. And so that gives a very particular lens that is very different from lots of other, components of the media. But in terms of our responsibility, I think this is a tricky question. I do think that the media has a role, and maybe one that we don't do a great job at always, of challenging narratives and trying to bring to light different narratives, particularly on climate change, where there are such powerful incumbent interests, both private and governments, that are setting the narrative. And so, yeah, there's certainly a role for journalism to challenge that and try to find new narratives. But that's different, I think, than sort of setting a narrative. Or, I think we'll talk about solutions journalism a little bit, and there's a role for this, but I think that ultimately the sort of highest orders for a journalist are truth-telling and skepticism and accountability. And bringing skepticism, I think, to stories is kind of utmost importance that, shouldn't be lost in any attempt to do kind of solutions journalism.
Yeah. So, Scott, you can speak to anybody around the world on Sunday mornings, and we all listen in. But where do you see your role in this truth-telling? Where does advocacy come in at all?
I'm not one of those who thinks that, with rare exceptions, advocacy should come in. The rare exceptions being, I don't think anybody is under any illusion that I'm anything but a Chicago Cubs fan. Although that being said, if the Cardinals play a good game, I will acknowledge it. And I think people could tell that, yes, I'm not in favor of school shootings, and I'm appalled at gun culture in the United States, and I'm upset by what's happened by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in part because it reminds me of lessons I thought the world had once again learned during the siege of Sarajevo, which I covered, and I think often my coverage did have an emotional, it had an emotional tinge. It was a Holocaust. It was the siege of Sarajevo, and I don't think my coverage was advocacy, but I hope it presented the depth of that story. I don't think we have an audience, and I'm in favor of a broad general audience insofar as you can. I see, as the three of us have been talking since alighting here, there is no the media anymore. We have been vivisected into 1,000 different streams. People used to use the term the media. They were referring to news organizations, and of course that's no longer the case. Anybody, and there is something charming in this, anybody with a cell phone is now the media. They can post something that will move people. It can be the scene of a massacre in Kiev, which is important to see. It can be an otter eating a cube of cheese, which can be quite charming to see. And it wouldn't surprise me if the otter gets, many more likes than anything else that's on of a given day. And I don't think we're all necessarily in competition on that score. But there is no force known as the media anymore. Those places that are still in business as news organizations have a responsibility, as Nick said, to tell the truth and to be skeptical, to be irreverent. I also think for those of us who are trying to go for a broader general audience, we have to have a continuing relationship with an audience. We cannot sound just one note. We cannot talk about any one or any 10 topics. I think we have to address the complexity of lives that people have. Otherwise, by the time we have something important to say, no one will be there to absorb it. And to me, the business is only worth doing if you know that there are people who are paying attention to you and not turning away. That doesn't mean that every other story has to be about the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, of which we had just one.
There is an element, right, of entertainment, even in the most serious journalism.
I used to shy away from the word entertainment, but I don't anymore. I think that's necessary to keep a conversation going. I think we have to address the whole person, so I don't, I'm more comfortable in using the word. But it's important to me to have a broad general audience, and I don't mean to be histrionic about this, but I think there's a real correlation between the growth of free and fair information, which developed into the press, and democracy. Because I think you don't have a democracy that works unless you have free and fair information from which people can reach judgments. And I'm very concerned about the health of that system at this particular point, because there's obviously a lot of misinformation, a lot of non-information, a lot of malicious non-information. And people can get any news they want. And you can, and the fact is, if you go to, let's say, the site of a responsible news organization, the Washington Post, the BBC, I certainly think NPR, and you don't ask to see any stories about climate, after a while, the algorithms won't disturb you with any stories about climate. It will give you exactly what you want, what it thinks you want to know about. Maybe thinks isn't the word, but exactly what your history suggests to the algorithm is what you want to see. And so if you're interested in climate as an issue, you have to tip your hand. You can't rely on whatever force you call the media to do that for others.
So one of the challenges with climate coverage is that the science is very complex. We've listened to a lot of difficult ideas today.
Yeah.
And how do you build trust in your discussions or the way you write with readers so that they have faith that you, in a very superficial way, most of us communicate, is accurate and right? How do you go about that?
That's a good question. And I don't know that I think of that sort of in a conscious way. I mean, certainly like an element of transparency in the reporting and the writing is important. And, not particularly like, so for my organization, if we're kind of within the world of climate change, and even though we do try to reach out in terms of readership, we have partnerships with NPR and others, but since we're already in the world, there can be kind of like a conceptual bias certainly to like the advocacy community, and so in terms of sourcing, like reaching out to different sources and being transparent about that, I think helps. I guess, it comes down to transparency.
So transparency is interesting because many news organizations, certainly in the US now, are letting people a little bit behind the curtain, right? How did I get this story? Or we're posting videos from Kiev and other places in Ukraine at the moment with reporters talking about how they made the sausage, as the saying goes. But
I mean, we try and be transparent ultimately about everything. There's sometimes compelling reasons in a given story where you protect a source, and that's all part of our responsibility too. I think also to have a general audience, which is what interests me, you need to challenge them every now and then. You need to, and I've been thinking of a story I did. It was right before the 2016 elections. It was in Bessemer, Alabama, which is right outside of Birmingham. And it was with a group of steel workers. Most of them happened to be black steel workers. And they were upset over what would seem to be the imminent cancellation of the pipeline, and which was the source of a lot of their livelihood, obviously. Steel industry built Birmingham. They were very proud of having built Birmingham. It was difficult, tough, demanding work for, and a couple of them were women, for real men and women. And they thought that people who were not sympathetic to the way they had built Birmingham and the country, didn't understand the importance of their livelihood, wanted to put them out of business. They referred to the places that made the fiberglass propellers as the whirlybirds that would obviously be necessary and, to capture wind energy. They referred to that as the whirlybirds, and they said, and I don't think anybody contradicted their logic, they said, look, they employ over 1,000 people in the steel plant. You put one of those whirlybird factories in here, they're going to hire 50 people, and none of them will be us, because nobody is going to pay for us to learn this new technology, and we've got families to support, and we've got lives. And I'm glad we put that on the air. I think that reflected the way a lot of people were thinking one way or another. I don't think you understand, forgive the bad choice of words, but the deep currents that something like climate change can affect, particularly in a democracy that's supposed to be responsive to popular will, unless you hear from voices like that. And there were many people in our audience that said, "Why did you, of all the people that you had to interview, why them?" Well, that's why we had to do it. And by the way, you take a look at the election results that ultimately came in from Bessemer, and you understood why the electoral votes went where they did, ruling out the possibility of a steal. But I'm being a little arch about that. But I think you have to do that with an audience to maintain your trust, to maintain your integrity. I like to think our audience, there were parts of it who didn't like it, but they also understood that we weren't just going to pat them on the head and tell them that everything they think is right. Because when the time comes to say something really very important that they really need to hear, I like to think that they know that we'll be straight with them.
You're reminding me a little bit of running our coverage of the Gulf oil spill. Yeah. And learning how many families were made up of both oil workers and the fishermen relied on the rigs for catching fish down there. So there were huge mixes and within individual families that we needed to reflect.
Those complexities are just part of human life.
Right?
And we can't fairly report a situation without. I mean, I thought of something. Did you want us to do headlines for what we heard today?
We'll do headlines later on.
We'll do headlines later.
Well, I have one.
I came up with it.
I have one other thought on trust, if I can, because I think that and this is sort of downbeat, but certainly in the U.S., like the election of Trump, I think for journalists there was a lot of navel gazing in terms of trust and seeing, the different sectors of people and how people trust totally different sources of news. And it's not just the media. Someone was talking about like the high level of trust in government in Scandinavia, and there's like very low level of trust in government in the United States, certainly. Yeah. And so trying to get beyond that, I mean, the people who are reading my stories and listening to Scott, like for the most part probably, unless they're contrarians, are trusting already.
So I want to make a point about trust as well, because I think there was a lot of criticism at some points of political journalism for being very much he said, she said journalism. And for years, I would say, well, science journalism is different because there's a preponderance of evidence on one side, and you don't have to always give the other side, right? You don't have to give the flat Earth point of view because we know science has moved beyond that. You don't have to give the climate deniers' point of view at some point because you don't have to give the AIDS deniers. And I think this past year has actually rattled some of my confidence because so many people have questioned basic public health science, and it's been very hard to all the time back up the science. And of course, public health involves political decisions and policy making as well as public health. But Nick, you are dealing, we have some luxury, Scott more than I do, but some luxury in choice of topic. You're dealing specifically with an area of coverage where the ultimate goals are years ahead. How do you maintain interest in a story? How do you find different angles on this story when in the big goal isn't changing very quickly?
Yeah, and often it's also you're writing about imagined futures. It's a big challenge, and I guess one approach is not unique to climate journalism, but just about trying to tell stories and human stories and find stories that people connect with. And I mean, I wrote a profile of an engineer who had worked at Exxon for his whole career and then left because he was sort of fed up with the company and its inaction on climate change. And he moved with his whole family from Houston to a NetZero community in Colorado, which ironically enough now has been bought. It was only partially built, and the developer bought it, and the new developer is putting in natural gas lines. But anyway, and that was one of the I heard a ton from readers from that. After I wrote that story, like CNN featured him, and he was on podcasts and on a documentary for Frontline, which is like on public television in the U.S. So I mean, all to say, some of it comes down to the basics of journalism, and trying to, on the one hand, I would say some things change very little, but now increasingly, the impacts of climate change are beginning to change much faster, and we're seeing that. And so that's a kind of very visceral. I don't want to call it a tool. That's kind of crass, but
Yeah.
So one of the challenges with climate coverage is that the science is so very complex. Tell me how you deal with that on the radio, on the spur of the moment.
I say, well, let's let our science desk do this, and they're very well. There's
many of them who came from the Washington Post.
Yes, exactly.
I used to work with them.
We actually do run everything past the science desk because we want to be careful we just want to be responsible, much as anything. We try and tell the story as best we can, and sometimes we will make mistakes. I can't put it any better than that. And we really do our best to be conscientious about it. I think we have begun to understand, and some of these truths reveal themselves, I think, almost as, you would chuck several skins in the development of a story. I think we begin to understand now so much of the violent weather we've seen in recent years is caused by climate change. I don't think, a few years ago, I think we were a little bit hesitant to make that assertion because we thought, temperatures do go up, temperatures do go down, maybe this is just once every 100 years. I think with greater confidence now and with a pattern of conduct, we can make that judgment. And there were people who made that judgment before we ever did, who I think turned out to be right, but we have to be careful. And I will add, almost as a parenthetical, I certainly don't want to talk to people who believe in a flat Earth, about a flat Earth. But there are all kinds of other reasons to talk to them.
Oh, yes.
And in any event, I do think even in the middle of the pandemic, there were good questions we had to raise about what the CDC said,
I'm talking about balancing stories with two sides, and I think
I think that's part of what we do, to try and help people think that through, and not just to assume that everything that we're handed, particularly by a government agency, is correct. But I also think the complexity of the story is why some of us got into this business. It wasn't because the story we wanted to tell could be always contained in just a few words, but that it would reveal something that was worth knowing and worth sharing. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me about the steelworkers in Bessemer, Alabama, they didn't see themselves in the future.
Right.
They didn't see themselves in the new economy that they thought was coming, not obviously quickly enough for probably for the planet, but they didn't see a role for themselves there. And I think insofar as we can tell stories that allow people to identify and empathize, that might make a contribution. But I hope we do that more or less all the time. At least I think that's what we aspire to do.
So, Nick, tell me how you decide upon what stories to tell, whether it comes from an editor or whether you hear from sources, and how the process comes together.
Well, I mean, the short answer is it's, of course, a combination of these things, but I would say most of my stories come from me or from my, sources rather than my editors. And yeah, I think that it's sort of, the reporting kind of feeds on itself, so that when you sort of develop relationships with sources, and then sometimes from readers who read your stories, they can kind of feed. And that's one of the benefits of being, sometimes, because like my entire newsroom, for many newsrooms, that would be the beat of one person or a handful of people. But we're all climate reporters, and so we have then these niches, and like mine for the last couple of years has been oil and gas within that. But the benefit of that is that you start to like see the beat and see the issue in new ways, and start to talk to reporters, and particularly when most of the media covers oil and gas, say from more of a business perspective. So I guess it's sort of feeding off of the beat.
Yeah.
Every now and then I come up with my own ideas, and they are really sometimes quite ridiculous. That's why we have a staff. That's why we have editors. I'm given a little bit of indulgence. We have wonderful producers who bring in ideas, and we're dependent upon them. We read other media. We take a look at everything that's out on what I think we sometimes refer to as the news landscape, and think, this is something worth going into. I must say, too, for a weekly show, we feel there has to be the mixture, there has to be the balance. It depends on the week. Obviously, following the shootings in Uvalde, we did have to make room for much more on Uvalde. I think it was the first week we didn't have anything about Ukraine for a few months. And that's what we had to do, because people, I think, and not just about Uvalde, but about school shootings and gun legislation and all the kind of attendant arguments. But we also have to have book interviews. We have to have interviews with film directors and actors. We have to have interviews with musicians. As I say, otherwise we don't have a continuing audience, which is what we want. Now, there are exceptions to that. Obviously, following a major news event that happens on our watch, we throw everything out. And we'll do that. And I, for example, I've been very attracted by the idea. It's being debated in our newsroom now. We have names for hurricanes. Should we have names for natural disasters that are caused by climate change? Would that help us? I'm probably using the wrong word, but to personify it in a way. I happen to think that's a good idea, but I can't make that decision alone. And that's one of the things that I think interests me. I think it's beginning to change the way we think of climate change.
Yeah, I'm thinking most of those disasters now are known by the names of the communities they hit. I was in Paradise as the fires were still smoldering, and then we think of it as Paradise and Paradise climate refugees we started writing about afterwards, I think. But yeah, that's an interesting idea. I think we'd be going through names very quickly right now.
Yeah, yes, we would. Mercy would.
Another thing, you have such a specialty. Traditionally, the Washington Post was a newspaper. No longer, we do a little bit of everything. But what do you feel of the pressures to provide information on different platforms?
You know, I enjoy them for the most part. I mean, it's. I think, for example, if I were our number 3 correspondent at the White House or the Pentagon, I would be driven nuts at having to file.
Filming and
yes,
and
exactly. Having to do everything for every media that was available at that particular point. But I can manage it, and I welcome it, and I think that's the only way we can communicate with people.
Right, people pick things up
these days, and I welcome the opportunity to do that. I wouldn't want to be left out of it.
I have to say, some of our most powerful climate stories, I think, are visually driven, with comprehensive captions to. And I don't know are you having to provide photographs to go with you?
Well, no, not having to. So I mean, I think it's an opportunity for us, but I think certainly my organization, there's a recognition that we shouldn't try to do things unless we can do them well. You know, so not gonna ask.
I wouldn't have gotten anywhere with that, Nick.
It's crazy. No, but I mean, in that, I think that like at smaller newspapers, there can be pressure for reporters to have to, do audio and video and write a story, and the 3 are not always compatible simultaneously.
So I would say that as we've grown, which we've done since 2008 enormously, but back then there was that pressure. I mean, to provide, and we didn't do it very well, right? My photographs are not the best, but there was an awful lot of pressure to get whatever you could when you were out, and I think that's changed, and we're getting. We've got a terrific podcast, we've got extraordinary video journalists, we've got great professionals leading us and helping us through all those different media right now.
Increasingly, it's interesting, when I do a story in the field, which we're just beginning to do now, they send a really great photographer with us.
No, and what fun it is to work with a really great photographer.
Oh, it's wonderful, but that's because the website has become such an important component.
Yeah.
And we did another parenthetical, but we did the story of a 10-way transplant of kidneys at the Houston Medical Center, and they had that medical photography is a great specialty, and this guy was just terrific. It was wonderful.
I'm seeing we're getting low on time, and I really want other people to have the opportunity to ask questions as well. So I think Atul has a question over there.
This is like a dream team, so I have to ask a question. I am kind of wondering, this may be very US-centric, so apologies to many in this room, but how do, I've lived in the US for 40 years now. I feel that the conversations have completely fragmented. There is no conversation about climate in particular.
That's well said.
But there are people in the middle, in, say, the Republican Party who are interested, but they are either afraid or they just don't want to come out. I'm just wondering from the two of you, or all of you actually, how do you, because as we saw today, these are complex issues, you know that. How do we need that conversation. We need some political solutions. Yeah. And right now it's so polarized. Right?
It is polarized, but not, I have a quick answer from...
Absolutely right, and I think you're absolutely right, and we've agreed about it, and it makes me despair sometimes. Yeah.
But when you go out to do stories, and I've done stories along the Mississippi of flooding, which are heavily Republican areas with people who were not believers in climate change, they're living it now. And I think you see that effect coming through in universities, and the people who work, who advise farmers in those areas are realizing they have to change. And so politically at a high level, there may be very little conversation going on, but there's an awful lot going on in the ground. And I think that's so true of other issues as well, that when you can end up on the end of, nasty emails and things, and it's much harder on social media, but emails, but actually when you telephone people and talk to them about things, most people are a lot more reasonable than they see when they're just being talking heads or shouting at each other. So
I think my question is more about policy? Because
Yeah,
I
I
see
think
that
it's very
in
hard.
Europe.
Right.
And the Europeans, for all their differences, make policy, good or bad. I mean, we can debate that. But the US, there is no policy at the federal level.
Yeah, and
Right. I think it'll be bottom.
yeah, I think that that some of this is the broader of what Frances was talking about, and then I think a fair amount of it is sort of what Bill McKibben was talking about, is structural to the way the Senate works. And sometimes it can be that simple, and the way that there's certain power structures, and particularly fossil fuel power structures, that are just able to sort of have enough sway, despite being disconnected from, I think, the majority of public opinion.
There's also, we have spent a lot of time over the past few months interviewing farmers and ranchers, livestock business, and they're very aware of the effects of climate change. They pay for it personally and directly every day, one way or another. And this also is amplified by the effects of recession and inability to get crops to market and being burned out and scorched out. And it's up to them to make a leap to policy. They don't doubt that climate change exists, but where does the decision fall on the decision they make as citizens in a democracy? And that part I don't know, and I don't think we should fill in the blanks. It's up to them to tell us what they're thinking, and we see it. But insofar as I can say that I've gotten to know them in the process of interviewing them, I'm sure that doesn't necessarily translate to the vote they cast for a candidate in Congress. And I think that's where, and look, to get back onto what Bill McKibben was saying, if the popular movements begin to show that people vote because of climate, I guarantee you what we call the news business will cover it. That's what we're in business to do.
I have a question about pressures I know are out there to change and produce a more positive climate narrative than people see in news outlets. What's your thinking about that? Have we been too negative or too skeptical?
You should take that first.
Well, I think there's a difference between being too skeptical and too negative. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is kind of a structural bias towards negative stories. And in particular, like...
Well, absolutely. We don't write every time a plane lands. We
Sure.
write about the one time the plane crashes, right? So,
Right. And so I think there is something to that. So I don't want to discount it, but I also think that it's not necessarily the job of journalists to make people hopeful. I mean, if the situation is desperate,
Yeah.
don't say it's hopeful. And this economist who I once wrote about said, "I'm not hopeful, but I'm determined."
I'm determined. That's very nice.
So I guess that's kind of a hedging answer that I hear it's valid criticism, but again, it's not, I don't think it's sort of the job of journalists to give a positive message necessarily,
Yeah.
Julie, you inspired our first question, so have another one.
Do you think that issues or challenges can be communicated with a higher level of objectivity than solutions? And if so, why do you think so?
All I caught was objectivity. I didn't...
So the thing is, it sometimes, and based on the previous discussions, it seems like I understood that when we are talking about solutions, maybe we are communicating opinions instead of facts. And I want to understand better this perception of speaking about solutions is less objective than speaking about problems.
And this brings up something that I think fulfilling the role I am supposed to fulfill in editorial meetings is somebody will say, there's this new program doing such and such, we should do a story about it. And I will say, let's see if it works. Because we could fill our air with all kinds of interesting ideas, and I think a lot of them are worth covering as ideas. But I think, as was suggested by one of our speakers earlier today, really it's the idea that results in a product that changes things. The product, a policy that has some demonstrable effect. And I think we can fill a lot of airtime just talking about interesting ideas, but I also think what's really necessary to cover is those things that have some demonstrable effect, because they in fact can give can give people hope. I mean, years ago I did a story about they were building a dam in Tigray, province of Ethiopia, that I think we can fairly say now has been afflicted by climate change. At that particular point, there was simultaneously a civil war, there was drought, there was violent weather, and because of the drought, water had disappeared from many areas. We're farming, we supported people. To make a long story short, and I loved this story, a dam was being built. It had been located at the proper place by engineers using satellite technology, but they built the dam by hand. People in the surrounding villages of Tigray did it with shovels and with wheelbarrows and ultimately patting it into place with their hands. It was one of the most moving stories that I ever covered. I still think about that. And as the Ethiopians who ran the program said, people have a relationship with this dam. It's part of their lives. This is not a government bureaucrat or a United Nations bureaucrat coming in and saying, look, you've got water, let's be grateful. This is something that they have given to themselves with their own hands. I utterly love that story, and to this day, people think of it as a human story and don't necessarily make the connection to climate change, that's why the dam had to be built. And I'm not going to lecture anybody and tell them that's wrong. But what I like to think is that people can encounter a story like that and see a role for themselves. Maybe not necessarily building a dam with their hands, but doing something with their hands and their heart to change policies, to change thinking.
We actually have a section, and I think the New York Times does too, that is a climate solutions section. And I haven't written for it for a while. The last story I did was out of Philadelphia and the sewage system, which is a combined sewage system, meaning that when there's flooding, the sewers actually go out within the city into the creeks within the city, so you get raw sewage flowing out. And the Philadelphia Water Company is doing a lot of work to try to prevent as much water going into the sewage system, so they're doing a lot of greening and putting out water barrels and things like that. So that's not a sort of necessarily happy story. It's an experiment to try to stop a problem that exists because of overwhelmed infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing that you made me think of in terms of writing about things that work, a challenge with climate change is when we don't know what's going to work, right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
And I mean, I think that journalists should write about solutions, but should keep the skepticism hat when we're doing it, because that's the role. There are companies and industry associations and advocates who want to tell positive stories about things, and that's good that they do that. And I think part of the role of the journalist is to remain skeptical. And that's not to say the positive stories aren't true and there, and we should write about them, but skeptically. Yeah.
I'm seeing 2 minutes left on the timer, and Christopher has a question.
Yeah, I just want to follow through on this objectivity thing, and I'm loving what you're saying, but I've been on the receiving end a few times of being interviewed by journalists, and I've often felt that the journalist actually has the story and the agenda already fixed in their head, and they're just looking for evidence to prove their ideas, and they're not at all being skeptical or questioning or objective. And that's my experience, and I think particularly in the UK press, there's a lot of opinion in the journalism, and there is a lack of balance actually. And you guys sound very reasonable, but I just wonder, are you
I'm glad he added
having
that.
lived on both sides of the Atlantic, I would say there's a very different tradition, having moved to the US from many other countries. And actually, it's one. I don't want to dominate, but objectivity is maybe not the right word, and I shy away from it. I think fairness is the word. I want people to think my stories are fair, and you've don't feel these stories were fair. That doesn't mean that I write a lot of things that people don't like, but generally they understand exactly why I've written them. And I very rarely have people who sort of come after me afterwards, even if they don't like it. For those, there are many other people who come after me for other reasons who aren't part of the stories. But I think representing fairly what you see is more important than some notion of objectivity, which is almost impossible to keep to, because the first sentence you write is going to reflect some choice. I mean,
and keeping an open mind.
Keeping an open mind.
Because
I learn things.
You go into a story, you kind of have to have an idea of what the story is, right, in order to try to write it. But a story I wrote very recently ended up being totally different. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. You know, you speak to someone who says something that's totally not what you were expecting to hear.
The best thing is when you go out thinking you're reporting one story and you come back with a different story.
That's absolutely. I was once a long-haired, and our daughters, they see pictures of me and they say, "Why is Baba wearing a wig?" A long-haired student radical that was trying to overthrow all governments in the world, I think, at that particular point. I wound up going into journalism. And I tell people that if you're in the news business, as opposed to the polemics business, nothing acquits you of your nostrums more quickly than journalism. Because you meet people that you think you agree with and they're insufferable. You meet people that you think you disagree with and they turned out to be delightful and humane and approachable. And you see ideas that once attracted you close up and you think, boy, did I get that wrong. And I sometimes tell people to reassure them, at least in our news organization, with some exceptions I'm sure, no, we do not have an ideological object in mind. All we want is a good story. Our interests are not that large. We want a good story. We want to communicate with our audience. And so we don't have ideological suppositions that can't be, I think, easily overturned by the facts and what we see in the face when we look at a story.
Oh, gosh. Can we go over for a couple of minutes? Because I see questions coming up. We'll see if we can answer them quickly. Alejandro.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your opinion about all the greenwashing that we are looking on the media, and because the facts will be against this greenwashing, so I want to hear your opinion about that, and what will be the perspectives for the next years?
Sure. So, I mean, this consumes a lot of my work on one level, trying to be skeptical of all of that and sort of hold companies, in the case of greenwashing, or governments, to test it and probe it. I think it's, I'm very skeptical of a lot of the private sector pronouncements. And by skeptical, I don't necessarily mean of questioning people's motives. It's not that, necessarily people are lying, but particularly when we're talking about something that's 30 years away, and, how do you, that's what a lot of you have been focused on here about, like, the steps of accountability, right? So, but yeah, I think that has to be like a huge focus of the media, is to try to tell that story.
So I would like, before the end of today, to run around the table and make sure everybody's had a chance to speak. So maybe now we'll take one or two more just quick questions, and then we'll wrap up, I think, because everybody has an evening and dinner ahead of them. And these guys will be around to answer your questions later. So I guess there's one down there.
Well, Scott, you mentioned a few times that it's important to become or to be responsible. And Nick, on the other hand, suggested that got to be skeptical. I think being responsible is very basic. So why can't this particular approach be adopted by more journalists?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the...
No.
I got the preface.
You emphasized quite a few times that...
Skeptical, yeah.
You got to be responsible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, why can't this kind of approach be adopted by more journalists?
Why can't more journalists
be skeptical?
Be responsible?
I like to hope that journalists are skeptical. I think there are a lot of people who are in the media to use a term I said had gone out of business. So a lot of people you can see on websites, a lot of people you can read on websites who are not in journalism. They're polemicists. And it's a wonderful world that they have a right to be polemicists. And it can strike many people as looking like reporting and the news. For a citizen in the world today, there's no reason that they have to encounter a fact that makes them uncomfortable. They can find, and look, I know, I hear from a beloved family member who says, man, human beings have never landed on the moon. And Charlie, is there any chance that that's... see? And
Hang on, I remember driving through Utah with Daniel Burrows, who said, now we know people don't think, now we know why people don't think
I mean,
we landed on the moon.
And forgive me if I might quote something that I wrote in a novel. I mentioned this to Phil later the other day, but I wrote a novel called Windy City, in which somebody says, the fact is, the 22 people on staff who've won Nobels on the University of Chicago don't get any more votes than 22 people who believe they've had sex with space aliens. and that, by the way, did I miss something, Charlie, on that score? Okay. Yeah, he keeps all the good stuff to himself. In any event, and that's the thing to remember about democracy, and that's the thing to remember about the information system that we have now. People can find information to support any belief that they want to hold. Now, I like to think that some of this is surely for entertainment value. Some of it, I think, must have deep human motives that I know nothing about and can't explore. But it definitely is a source of competition for us. But there's no going back, because it's also enabled a proliferation of voices to be heard, and it means that somebody who's under fire in Kiev can share what's happening directly, and that's good. It means that somebody who is in the process of being dragged away by the police in Moscow because of a demonstration can toss their cell phone to a friend, and that can be seen by millions of people. So there are obviously many good things about that too. But I do worry about one drowning out the other. But ultimately, it's the audience has to be the arbiter of what they really value.
I was sorry, I thought you'd finish. I can't, because I can't think of wiser words to finish on, and I think, unfortunately, we do need to finish. But thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Scott Simon, Nick, thank you for